Edward IV, according to contemporary sources, was most immoderate in food and drink, and had grown fat in the loins by the time of his death. He was also immoderate in his love life. This unhealthy combination led to his death on April 9, 1483, at the age of 40, leaving his 12-year-old son Edward as heir to the throne. Fearful for his son and acutely aware that having power over a young monarch meant having power over the nation, Edward had named his ever-faithful brother Richard as protectorate to the young king. Richard, who Edward had bestowed with the titles and positions of Duke of Gloucester, Governor of the North, and so forth, had also married the Earl of Warwick's daughter, Anne, and thereby inherited all of his lands. All of this made Richard of Gloucester the most powerful lord in all of England. Richard was in Yorkshire when news reached him of his brother's death. Lord Hastings, who had been Edward's chancellor, urged Richard to assume his role as Lord Protector of the realm, and Richard agreed. At the time, young Edward was at Ludlow Castle, where he lived with his guardian, his maternal uncle, Lord Rivers. Richard wrote to Lord Rivers to set a time and place for meeting to escort the young king to London. The meeting was set for April 29th at Nottingham. It was agreed that each were to travel with an armed escort of only 600 men. When Richard and his cousin, the Duke of Buckingham, arrived in Nottingham, the young king was not there. And while Richard had brought the agreed-upon amount of men, it was discovered that, per the Queen's request, Lord Rivers had brought a force of 2,000 men as the boy's escort. When Richard inquired as to the whereabouts of the young king, Lord Rivers explained that Edward was not with him, as he had been sent ahead to Stony Stratford, where there were better accommodations for a young king. Pleasantries were observed, and though Richard had always been suspicious of the Woodvilles, a friendly conversation between the parties lasted well into the night. Richard said nothing of his suspicions until Lord Rivers departed to spend the night at another inn. Then he confided his suspicions to his cousin, the Duke of Buckingham. It was treason, and he planned on dealing with it sharply and quickly. At dawn, Lord Rivers arose to find his inn completely surrounded by Richard's soldiers. He and his nephew, the young king's half-brother, were arrested and taken to Pontefract Castle. Richard and Buckingham wasted no time in heading to Stony Stratford. There, as they had suspected, they found the young Edward, a boy dressed in blue with his blond hair shining beneath a soft hat of black velvet, already astride his horse, ready to leave for London. Richard dismounted and knelt before the boy king. He informed Edward that a plot had been uncovered, one formed by Lord Rivers and his nephew, designed to rob Richard of his duly appointed role of protectorate, a role which had been assigned by Edward's own father so recently deceased, and that those involved had been dealt with. Richard then dismissed the remainder of Edward's entourage, explaining that he and his men would now take charge. Edward was frightened and confused. His uncle, who had raised him, and his half-brother, both of whom he loved and trusted, had been taken from him, accused of treason, by an uncle whom he did not know very well. But he knew his father had trusted his Uncle Richard, and so he must too. Richard assured the boy that he was taking him to London, where he would be crowned as King of England. Along the way, they stopped at an inn, where Richard helped Edward to issue his first order as king. Edward was pleased to sign his name and new title on a piece of parchment, under which his adult companions also signed their names and mottos. May 4th, the boy king in blue, riding between two noblemen in black, reached London. Bells rang as they entered the city. The narrow, dirty London streets were crowded with cheering people, all eager to catch a glimpse of their new king, Edward V. At St. Paul's churchyard, they saw the boy escorted into the bishop's palace. It wasn't long, however, before Richard had the boy taken to live in the royal apartments in the Tower of London, where monarchs typically awaited their coronation. Hearing of her brother's arrest and fearful of Richard, Elizabeth Woodville fled into sanctuary in Westminster Abbey with her remaining 9 children, including her only other son. On June 11th, Richard wrote to Lord Neville, the city of York, and others, asking for their support against the Queen, her blood adherents and affinity, whom he suspected of plotting his murder. On June 13th, at a council meeting at the Tower of London, Richard accused Lord Hastings and others of having conspired with the Woodvilles against him. According to Sir Thomas More, Hastings was taken out of the council chambers, with Richard vowing he would not have dinner until the head was severed from the shoulders, and Hastings was summarily executed in the courtyard, while others, like Lord Thomas Stanley and Bishop Morton, were arrested. Bishop Morton was released into the custody of the Duke of Buckingham. On June 16th, the Dowager Queen Elizabeth Woodville agreed to hand over her youngest son, Richard, Duke of York, to the Archbishop of Canterbury, so that he might attend his brother Edward's coronation, planned for June 22nd. Buckingham was rushing all over London giving orders regarding the coronation. And then, on June 22nd, instead of a coronation, a sermon was preached outside Old St. Paul's Cathedral, declaring Edward IV's children illegitimate and Richard as the rightful king. The Bishop of Bath was said to have informed Richard that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, because Edward was still married to one Eleanor Butler. Shortly after, the nobles and commons convened and drew up a petition asking Richard to assume the throne. On June 26th, Richard accepted. On July 6th, Richard III was crowned at Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey had never seen a more gorgeous coronation than that of Richard III, the last of the Plantagenets who had ruled over England for more than 300 years. Almost every nobleman in the kingdom was there, turned out in his most elegant attire. None was more spectacular than the Duke of Buckingham, in blue velvet trimmed with golden cartwheels. Trumpets sounded, and the line began to move along a broad red carpet leading to the abbey. After the heralds with their trumpets came the abbots and the priests, walking behind a cross of gold. Then came the most noble lords and high officers of state, bearing first the sword of mercy, then the sword of justice, then the king's scepter with its ball and cross, next the king's sword, and last his heavy bejeweled crown resting on a pillow. Then came Richard in a purple robe, walking barefoot and bareheaded between 2 bishops in heavily embroidered robes. After the king, carrying the long train of the purple robe, came the Duke of Buckingham, plainly showing with each step that next to Richard he knew himself to be the noblest peer in the realm, with some right to the throne himself. After Buckingham, in order of rank, came the earls, the barons, and the lords. And then came the Queen. And who of all people was that tiny woman carrying the Queen's train? Lady Margaret, the mother of Henry Tudor, who, at that very moment, was waiting in Brittany for a chance to return and seize the crown for himself. To everyone's amazement, Richard III had given her this honor, even though he was well aware she had never stopped plotting for the downfall of the House of York and the final triumph of Lancaster. For a while after the young Duke of York joined his brother in the Tower, the princes were seen playing ball and archery in the courtyard. However, they disappeared from all sight after the summer of 1483, Rumor spread that Richard had had his nephews killed. The facts surrounding their disappearance remain unknown, though Richard remains the primary suspect. The Duke of Brittany had been well paid by Edward IV to keep strict watch over Henry Tudor and see that he did not escape to England. Now, as a price for continuing to keep Henry under guard, the Duke of Brittany asked Richard to help him fight against France. Richard III refused. The Duke, therefore, in a huff, turned completely about and joined in a plot to help Henry Tudor overthrow Richard, promising him 15 ships and 5,000 soldiers with which to return to England. By early fall, only 4 months after Lady Margaret had walked in Richard's coronation, she and her supporters had plans well laid for her son's return. Henry Tudor was to sail from Brittany to the south of England. There he was to be met by a force of English soldiers, commanded by the man one would least expect, the one who had carried Richard's train in the coronation, the Duke of Buckingham. After the coronation, the foolish Duke, spoiled by Richard with many honors, became possessed with the notion of being king himself. And why not, he thought. Who, by birth, had a better right? Certainly not Henry Tudor, whose grandfather was not even a nobleman. He was a Welsh servant who married Henry V's widow. He, Harry Buckingham, had royal blood on both sides of his family, and right there in his own castle was Bishop Morton, who was the very man to help him. Bishop Morton, an ambitious man, had been caught in an earlier plot against Richard III, but instead of having him sentenced to death with the others, the king had let him be sent to Buckingham's castle to be kept strictly under guard. Buckingham was joyful to find that the bishop was so sympathetic and understanding, as indeed he was. He understood the foolish fellow perfectly. "Your claim to the throne is indeed very good," began the bishop, "but your chance of gaining it is less than, let us say, that of Henry Tudor, who has his mother, Lady Margaret, working for him, as well as his stepfather, Sir Thomas Stanley. Moreover," said he, "Lady Margaret was arranging with the former queen for Henry Tudor to marry her oldest daughter, the Princess Elizabeth. This would unite in bonds of matrimony the houses of Lancaster and York, and bring peace to England. In this worthy cause no one," said the bishop, "could render greater service than he, Harry Buckingham." So, before he knew it, foolish Harry was deep in the plot to help, not himself, but Henry Tudor, to the throne of England. In mid-October, Richard III learned to his dismay that his friend had turned against him. With his usual speed, he proclaimed Buckingham a traitor and opened a campaign against him. The Duke's badly organized forces were already deserting him. Seeing what a fool he had been, the miserable fellow tried to hide, but was found, condemned for treason, and beheaded. Henry Tudor, meanwhile, had sailed just near enough to England to discover that the plot had miscarried. Turning cautiously about, he sailed back to Brittany to wait until his mother and friends had plans better organized for his return. Bishop Morton, far too clever to let himself get caught, had slipped off to a hiding place in Flanders. There he kept an ear cocked for the latest news from England to pass on to Henry. And not long after this he heard a rumor that the 2 princes living in the Tower of London had been murdered by their uncle Richard III. Henry Tudor needed all the help he could get. He heard from Bishop Morton, who was on the lookout in Flanders, that the Duke of Brittany had changed sides again, and was now being paid by Richard III to keep him in strict custody, and he must escape at once, now or never. Henry lost no time. One afternoon he and a few friends left the castle, casually, as if out for a bit of hunting. No sooner had they entered the woods than Henry tore off his suit, got into a servant's smock, and rode like mad for the French border, crossing over just 1 hour ahead of the men sent in pursuit of him. Bedraggled and destitute, he turned up at the elegant French court and begged Anne of France for protection, help, even enough to live on. Anne of France made the English refugee welcome, and also helped him against Richard III. Remembering her father's policy of protecting France by keeping the English fighting at home, she promised Henry Tudor 15 ships and troops enough to invade England when word should come from his mother that the time was ripe. In the summer of 1485, Henry Tudor returned to England. That spring, after waiting around in France for over a year, word had come at last that all plans for his return to England had been completed. This time he was to land in Wales. Men of Wales were ready to take up arms in support of their native son. Henry Tudor's return was even being heralded as the return of King Arthur, whose home had also been in Wales. Welsh bards and minstrels, roaming through the mountains and valleys, were singing ballads about their ancient, semi-mythical king and his knights of the Round Table, adding new verses to the Arthurian legend, as bards had been doing for 1,000 years. As it happened, just 1 week before Henry Tudor landed in Wales, the first book in English about King Arthur had been published in London by Sir William Caxton, the printer. It was called Mort d'Arthur, or The Death of Arthur, and had been written by Sir Thomas Malory while he was in prison during the Wars of the Roses. Malory finished it in 1469. 2 years later, Henry Tudor, then a boy of 14, had fled for refuge to Brittany. Now he was returning, and on August 7th, 1485, exactly 1 week after this book was published, Henry Tudor, of whom all the Welsh bards were singing, landed in Milford Haven on the west coast of Wales. Henry Tudor was far from confident, never having fought a battle in his life. For 2 weeks after landing in Wales, he had been marching northeast, adding to his forces as he went, but without knowing how to manage the men. He needed generals with experience. He needed the Stanleys. Sir William Stanley, his mother's husband, where was he? Where was Lord Stanley, his brother? Henry had sent both men orders to join him at once. Where were they? Would they never come? Had they deserted him? The question of where the Stanleys were was also disturbing King Richard. He had written them both, Lord Stanley and Sir William, whom he had pardoned for treason, to meet him at Nottingham. Lord Stanley had sent the feeble excuse that he was ill. Sir William did not reply. Both, commanding large armies of their own, were playing it safe. They did not intend to be on the losing side, whichever that might be. Though they favored Henry Tudor, as late as last Friday when they met him at Atherstone, they refused to commit themselves. Sunday, along an ancient Roman side road running east and west, Henry and Richard with their armies were traveling steadily toward each other, both men encased in full armor of medieval knights. Henry's standard and shield bore the red dragon, emblem of the first King of Wales. On King Richard's shield was his personal emblem, the boar. On top of his helmet he wore a golden crown. Above him floated the banners of England and of England's patron saint, St. George the Dragon Slayer. On April 22nd, 1485, the battle was to take place. On the brow of the hill on which he was encamped, Richard sat on his white horse, quietly scanning the battlefield, his lips set in a thin line. The golden crown on his helmet caught the rays of sunlight. To his right he saw the army of Sir William Stanley, of which he was uncertain. Straight ahead, on a rise of ground, were the forces of Henry Tudor. At his request, a man with keener sight than his own located the standard of the Red Dragon, and there, nearby beneath it, seated on horseback, was Henry. Richard made up his mind to take a tremendous risk. Alone, with no more than 100 volunteers from his own household, he would ride for Henry Tudor, crossing directly in front of the forces of William Stanley. He stood in his stirrups and, turning, cried to his men, "We ride for Henry Tudor." With that cry, Richard III began the Battle of Bosworth. Closing his visor, he took a battle-axe from one of his squires, spurred his horse, was off down the hill and across the intervening field. Fighting his way up the other slope, he came so close to Henry that the Red Dragon struck the ground as his standard-bearer parried the blow from Richard's battle-axe. But then William Stanley's forces showed which side they were on. With the cry of "Ap Tudor," they rushed on the scene, overwhelmed and broke through Richard's small band of men. Reaching the king, they pierced through his coat of mail. The crown, which had fallen from his helmet, was picked up by Sir William and placed on the head of the new king, who wasted no time in broadcasting leaflets telling of his victory, announcing that he, Henry Tudor, by the grace of God, was now King of England and France, Prince of Wales, and Lord of Ireland. On October 30th, 1485, Henry Tudor was crowned Henry VII. Now King of England, Henry set out to secure his position. One of the first things he did was to create a standing royal guard, something no king of England had ever done before. He also set out to secure England. England was in financial straits. The treasury had been depleted by the endless Wars of the Roses and Edward IV's extravagant lifestyle. The new King of England, Henry VII, set to work. He predated the beginning of his reign to 2 days before the Battle of Bosworth, a wily maneuver by which 28 lords loyal to Richard could legally be convicted of treason against King Henry VII. They were then executed and their properties seized. This act not only removed would-be opponents, but also quickly enriched England's treasury. Henry appointed Bishop Morton, who had already served him well, as Chancellor or head of the Treasury. The crafty bishop designed an unpopular system of taxation known as Morton's Fork, as any subject, rich or poor, could be caught on one of its 2 tines. During his exile, Henry had made a vow in December 1483 at Rennes Cathedral that if he became king, he would marry Edward IV's daughter, Elizabeth of York, uniting the houses of York and Lancaster and ending the Wars of the Roses, and he made good on this promise. On January 18, 1486, Henry VII married the Princess Elizabeth, as arranged by Henry's ever-forceful mother, Margaret Beaufort. Elizabeth was famed for her beauty, and her face is still familiar today. It is her face portrayed as the Queen in a deck of cards. Though it had been prearranged, Henry and Elizabeth had a happy, faithful marriage. Henry arranged that their first child should be born at Winchester Castle, the home of Britain's ancient kings. It was a great joy to them and the nation when in the fall of 1486 they welcomed their first child, a son. He was named Arthur. Today in Winchester Castle may still be seen a huge round table which was decorated at this time with a picture of King Arthur, the names of his knights, and in the center the new Tudor rose, combining the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York.